Cafe, where the take shape, thought find depth, and every conversation explores the art of thinking beyond the obvious. And today I have my special guest. He's award-winning author as well as a podcast host and the author of the book Love and Suffering, no other than Mr. Anthony Silard.
Hey
Welcome,
Daniel,
welcome.
thanks for having me on your show. I appreciate it.
Welcome, Mr. Anthony on Cafe. And can you please introduce more about yourself that I miss?
Sure, Daniel. So I'm a writer and I'm also a professor of leadership and organizational psychology at Luis Business School in Rome, Italy. I'm originally from Washington, D.C. My wife is from Mexico. We have two children, 12 and 9 years old. And really, I've spent the last 30 years of my life coaching and training leaders. So Fortune 500 CEOs, senior leaders, companies like Toyota, Boeing, Google, Apple, also the directors of many of the world's largest nonprofit organizations like CARE and Save the Children, also political leaders like cabinet ministers of G20 governments and mayors. And I've observed over time, what is it that makes for an effective leader and what sort of gets in their way. And one thing I found, which led to writing Love and Suffering, is that every CEO or leader who comes to me and who's facing major challenges in their organization, it always stems back to someone in their life they were never able to forgive. And so taking a kind of psychoanalytic perspective, I really wanted to understand that more and understand how is it that when we're unable to forgive someone, it kind of derails our best laid plans and prevents us from living the kind of life we desire.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world, Mr. Anthony. Thank you. Your book titled boldly links love and suffering. Can you explain the core mechanism by which our most painful experiences can create emotional change that block our capacity to give and receive love?
Well, it's interesting, Daniel, because when we're experiencing suffering, when we're experiencing pain, many of us, we just feel that pain and we feel like a victim. And that's where I think the first step in moving from suffering toward love is acceptance. So let me give you an example. There was one of the people I feature in the book is a guy who's essentially living in Midwest of the of the United States. He's just gotten married. He's got a couple kids. He's been married for a few years. He's watching TV on his suburban living room, and he gets drafted as a pilot to go to Vietnam. This was in the early 1970s, and within weeks he's in Vietnam and he's captured and he's a prisoner of war, POW, and he's in this cell with like rats and lice and cockroaches, and it's filthy, and he's becoming emaciated. He's lost like 30 pounds, and he's really he's really on his way to die soon because he just can't handle it. It's this abrupt change in his life, and almost out of nowhere he hears this voice, and the voice says to him, "This is your life." And he swears on it that he heard this voice that said this, whether that whether it's something that he made up himself or not, who knows. But he gets this message that you need to accept this is where you are right now. You're no longer back on your living room sofa with your wife and kids, watching TV. You're here in this rat infested cell, and you got to accept it. So he does that. He starts to accept it. Once he does that, everything changes for him. At that point, then he starts to exercise. He's doing a lot of push-ups and sit-ups. He starts talking to some of the other POWs, and checking in with them. And this was a huge turning point in his life. And this eventually he survived through the war. And it's called the Vietnam War, or in Vietnam it's called the American War. He survived through it, and and ended up living a much better life after that. So it all begins with acceptance. Now, many people ask me, now, hey, wait a minute, Anthony. In Love and Suffering, you're promoting acceptance. Is that passivity, that we should just allow things to happen that are unjust? And it's actually the opposite. When we accept what's going on in our lives, or what's going on outside our doors, what's going on in the world, as much as we may be disgusted with what's going on in the world, when we're able to accept, like, this is the way it is at this point in time, this is what's happening, then we allow like this real unfiltered information into our brains, like, this is what's happening. And so we're no longer fooling ourselves. In fact, if you look at in like psychology, a lot of the worst psychopathologies and illnesses, mental illnesses, are about not accepting what's happening, and not just what's happening outside of our doors, but what's happening inside of ourselves, our emotions, what we're feeling. So, for example, what I often tell people when they tell me, "Hey, I'm feeling lonely, I'm feeling depressed, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling exasperated, really disturbed by what's happening out there in the world, and feeling hopeless," I'll say to them, I'll say, "Well, why don't you invite all of those emotions over for dinner?" And someone will say, "Well, what are you talking about?" Like, literally invite your sadness over to dinner, invite your loneliness, ask them at the dinner table, "Hey, loneliness, here you are. So tell me why you're here. What do I need to learn from you?" So I'm actually one of the top two researchers on loneliness and organizations in the world right now. And all of the research on loneliness, everything that I've been able to discover, is really based on that. Like, you don't work through loneliness, but by just going and spending time with other people. You work through loneliness by starting with an inner detour and looking inside yourself and saying, well, why? Let me first accept, why am I lonely? What is provoking this loneliness? And how am I showing up in my relationships? And really be honest with yourself about it. And then from there, you can say, okay, well, you know what? Maybe I'd like to make some changes in the way I'm approaching relationships. And so you go out into the world, but nothing seems the same, because now you're seeing everything with new eyes. You're seeing people, relationships with new eyes. And I think that's what a lot about what Love and Suffering is about, is really like how we can, how we can kind of, if you think about how many of us, like, we go through life with our hands covering our eyes, and we cry about how dark it is. And what I'm trying to do with Love and Suffering is encourage people to take their hands away from their eyes and see the light, see the love that's in front of them every day, that most of us just aren't able to see. For the guy in the prison cell in Vietnam, it was seeing, like, hey, there's actually some good people in here, and I guess I can get to know them better, and I guess I've got time to, I can exercise, I can really work on myself, really question how I think about things, and that made all the difference.
Definitely, that makes a difference, Mr. Anthony. So the search results mention the idea of emotional change and emotional freedom. How would you define these change? Are you more about your self proactive belief, unconscious patterns, or stored trauma in the body?
Okay, well, all of us, Daniel, have stored trauma in our bodies, right? And if you look at the research on trauma, essentially there's one of three options for someone who experiences trauma. And if all of us experience trauma, which we do, that means there's three options for every one of us, right? So one option is no change. And there are actually some people who, they experience trauma and it doesn't affect them that greatly, or at least that's what they think. Because what they do is they start to numb their emotions. So they went through something so tragic, they just don't want to feel anymore. And so they become numb to those negative emotions. But unfortunately, that also numbs them to positive emotions like joy and enthusiasm and other positive emotions that really make life worth living. And so they live a kind of like a sterile, antiseptic kind of life. Then there's another group that well, the trauma takes them under, and that's where this prisoner of war in his jail cell, that's where he was headed. It's like Viktor Frankl in his book Life's Search for Meaning. Sorry, Man's Search for Meaning is the book. In his book, he's a Austrian psychologist, and he was captured by the Nazis. He was also in a forced labor camp in Nazi Germany, in Auschwitz. Actually, it was in Auschwitz in Poland, and it was run by the Nazis. And so he started studying other prisoners, and what he noticed is that if a prisoner lost hope, that then that prisoner, you could, within 2 days, you would see it in their eyes that they were about to die. They would lose hope, and they would look kind of like the way a baby can look at you when it's not really looking at you, like kind of eyes glassed over. And within 2 days, they would be prostrate and dead in their own urine and feces on the ground. And he said the people that were more likely to survive, the prisoners that were more likely to survive, they still had a hope for something. There was something they still needed to do in their lives. So maybe they needed to return home after the war to care for a child, or maybe they needed to complete a series of scientific experiments that they started before the war. There was something that they were so driven by that kept them alive. And I think this is really, when we think about trauma, this goes to the third group, which is those who experience growth from their trauma. And so there's a whole field of research about this in psychology called post-traumatic growth. Larry Calhoun, Richard Tedeschi, University of North Carolina are kind of the lead researchers on it. And they coined the term, in fact. And people who experience post-traumatic growth, when they experience suffering, that becomes an impetus for change. They change their priorities. They start thinking about the world differently. Their spirituality, the way they approach relationships, everything changes because of what they've experienced, not just what they've experienced, but the way they interpret what they've experienced. So there's a saying, which is, circumstances don't make a person, they reveal them. And so trauma is a circumstance in each of our lives. And the question is what we do with it. Let me give my own example. So I had a physically abusive stepfather when I was about 10, 11, 12 years old. And when a man comes into your home, sleeps with your mother, and beats you up, you don't feel like much of a person. And that's the way I grew up. And as a result, what did I do with that pain, that trauma? I let it naturally convert into anger. There's a lot of research, by the way, that there's a gender difference here. Not true for every man or woman or boy or girl, but if you look at averages across large cross-cultural samples, you find that when men experience pain or suffering, their coping mechanism is often to externalize it, and it manifests in aggression toward others. When women experience pain or trauma, it often psychosomatizes or manifests in depression. So internalizing it and feeling depressed. And so it depends. And many people flip these gender roles today, but there's still, it's interesting. So I was, I guess, a typical boy where with all the pain I was experiencing at home, I went out and got into fights and did all kinds of things I shouldn't have been doing. And that actually carried through up. I'm 58 now. That carried through into my 20s and 30s, where I was having a lot of challenges in my career and in my life, because I just was a mess inside. I couldn't process all that trauma. And then what happened was I went traveling alone to Argentina. I went hiking for a few weeks in Patagonia. And while I was on this hike, believe it or not, I was able to forgive my ex-stepfather for the physical abuse, for almost breaking my back on a radiator, some of the other things he did. Physical abuse, no sexual abuse, fortunately. And that like being able to forgive him and really think about So one of the strategies on forgiveness and love and suffering is to forgive is to give for. And what that means, Daniel, is that when we can forgive others by giving for them to ourselves. So I could give for my ex-stepfather to myself and say to myself, he had a really rough life himself. He was unemployed, an unemployed journalist at the time. Felt like society had kind of chewed him up and spit him out, and he felt powerless. And so he found his only semblance of power by essentially victimizing, attacking a young boy, right? And that
Mm-hmm.
gave him, this abusive behavior made him feel like more of a man. Well, obviously that's not a really good way to sort of give yourself a sense of power. It's power over rather than power with. And I think this is a big mistake even in our foreign policy, where we abuse power by trying to take power over other countries or communities or people, instead of realizing that true power is shared. It's where we help others grow, and then they in turn want to help us grow. But that's the way he saw the world. So I could give for him to myself. And one of the exercises in love and suffering, and I'll share this with you for your listeners, because I think it's one of the best ones in love and suffering, is is to write down what you have trouble forgiving someone for, and what is it that you just can't let go of, and write down those behaviors on their part. So, for example, I could write, well, my ex stepfather was, he hit me. He was physically abusive, and so on and so forth. And then what I can do, and what I urge your listeners to do, is for each of those behaviors, next to it in the next column, make a few columns, right, in this little chart. In the next column, write what character quality describes that behavior or is aligned with that behavior. So I can say, well, insensitive, callous, um, selfish, and write down some of the character qualities I would associate with those behaviors that he engaged in. Right now comes time for the third column, and this is the tough one. In the third column, write down who in your life, at any point in your life, would attribute that same character quality to you. And so, doing that exercise, I realized, I've also been insensitive and selfish and callous in my own life. And there are people that I haven't treated very well. So that was a game changer for me, because then it was like, okay, I can forgive him. I can let go of it. And now the interesting thing about forgiveness, we have a lot of misconceptions in our society about forgiveness. Now I know I love your podcast, Daniel. I know it's really about thinking more abstractly. So I think you and your listeners will like this one, where so there's like Ronald Niebuhr, for example, and many philosophers, they say forgiveness is the highest form of love. Well, I don't agree with that at all. Okay, so forgiveness is a wonderful thing to do, and I think it's an important step toward love, but it's not a place where you want to stop. Let me explain that. Forgiveness is impossible without judgment. Until we judge someone, there's nothing to forgive. The only reason we need to forgive someone is because we have judged them. So if you think about it, judgment creates the problem and forgiveness creates the solution. Also, forgiveness is a very paternalizing and patronizing kind of emotion. So for example, would you like someone to say to you, hey, you know what? You made my life really miserable, but I want you to know I forgive you for it. Like, forgiveness is a power play. It's basically someone saying, I hold propriety over what is right and wrong. You did wrong. I am right. But despite my having the moral high ground, I forgive you for what you did and being the person you are. That's very patronizing. It's really talking down to another person. So I think what we need to do, if we want to really grow in our lives toward love and bring love into our lives, is move beyond forgiveness to gratitude. So forgiveness is, I forgive you for what you did. Gratitude is, I'm grateful for what you did. Now, Does that mean I'd want it to do it again? No. So we have this another really, counterintuitive point in love and suffering is that we see forgiveness and we say, okay, forgive and forget. We're taught that as children, forgive and forget. Well, again, I totally disagree. Forgive and remember. It doesn't mean remember it every day. Don't think about it all the time. But if you're walking at night and you fall into a ditch, do you want to forget the location of the ditch? Or do you want to say, okay, that's where the ditch is. I'm going to try to avoid that ditch in the future, right? So forgiveness and trust are two different things. And I want to explain this. Forgiveness is necessary for personal development, just as it was for me. So I could move past all that, resentment that I felt toward my ex-stepfather. So forgiveness is necessary for personal development. Trust is necessary for relationship development. In other words, if I wanted to have a continued relationship with my ex-stepfather, I don't need to just forgive him. I need to be able to trust him. Well, I chose not to do that. I thought, no, that's okay. I forgive him as a human being, but it's also not, I don't necessarily, it's not in the cards for me to have a future relationship with him. After all that happened, I'd rather find people that I feel are more trustworthy and that I could count on and sort of be authentic with, and that is not necessarily him. So I think moving from forgiveness to gratitude, one visualization I recommend for your listeners is to think back in your life to the greatest teacher you've ever had. Think back and think about, like, who was it in high school or grade school or university or or a sports team or a dance troupe or an acting troupe or whichever it was. Think about who did you really most learn from in your life, and then once you have that person in your mind, then what you can do is do this visualization where you imagine you're back in that classroom or studio or sports field, and before you move on with your life from that phase where you're learning from this person, I want you to go back in and imagine yourself, you're about to get up from your desk or where you're sitting, and you're about to leave, and it's going to be a farewell to this greatest teacher you've ever had. But now in this visualization, imagine you can turn back toward that teacher, look them in the eye, and what would you like to say to them? Okay. So when I do this, most people in my conferences, what they say is, I want to say thank you for teaching me, for helping me grow. So that's gratitude. And what most of us don't realize is that our greatest teacher is often that person who, through their example, we learned from, even if it was a negative reinforcement, even if it was, we learned because of the suffering we experienced as a result of that interaction. And this is the thing, is that so many of us these days, we just want to stay home, be behind our screens, not go out. Like if you look at like the proportion of young people going out today, it's a fraction of what it was a few decades ago. People are really cloistered ever since the pandemic. We're still psychologically quarantined. Many of us, we're still psychologically incarcerated, and we're not able to go out and interact with others. But I think what many of us miss is that even if you have a really difficult breakup, you can be grateful to that person because they joined you in the ring of interaction, so you can learn what you need to learn, so you can move forward and bring more love into your life. Sometimes maybe you learn because you don't want to be in a relationship with someone like that person, but maybe there's a few things that you also learned that you did like about that person. Maybe they weren't enough to sustain the relationship, but things that, there's lessons you learn that you take forward. And so I think really once we move into a space of gratitude, there's a lot of psychological research that shows us that gratitude is one of the only kind of panaceas in our life that really brings in happiness and well-being, even when we've been through tragic circumstances.
So, Mr. Anthony, can you please invite our listeners to support your book, your podcast, or whatever projects that you want to promote on Abstract Essay?
Well, okay, thank you, Daniel. So you've been so kind. You have the Amazon page of my book right there. So yeah, I would say please check out the book. Check out Love and Suffering. There's going to be a lot more if you like what we've been talking about here. Also, I'd like to offer two free books to your listeners. The first book is called The Myth of Happiness: How Your
Hmm.
Definition of Happiness Creates Your Unhappiness. And the second book is The Myth of Friendship: How Your Misunderstandings About Friendship Keep You Lonely. So if you'd like to have these two books, thank you so much, Daniel. There's the page. To get to that page, all you have to type in is The Art of Living Free, like you see it there at the top, theartoflivingfree.org/free happiness and friendship books. Again, theartoflivingfree.org/free happiness and friendship books. It's super easy. You put in your email, you get a confirmation email, you confirm it, and then you get the download links. So yeah, I hope you enjoy them. These two books are also rooted in a lot of stories, a lot of psychological research, but really what I try to do as a writer and professor is it's interesting. I think there are very few people in academia who can really take really relevant research and just make it interesting and friendly and easily accessible for everyone and for others. And so that's kind of my goal as a writer is so it's not just like me sharing ideas. It's also stories of real people, and it's also credible research and in these fields of happiness, loneliness, and so forth, and social connection, and how we can take what we can learn from what's been done out there, and all these studies and stories, and come up with our own strategies so we can live more meaningful lives. That's what I'm aiming for.
Well, people, let's support Mr. Anthony Silard because of you support him for sure. More and more empowering books like this to rise. So, Mr. Anthony, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Daniel. You've been a great host. I appreciate you.
More to come, people. See you soon.